Well, hopefully I can communicate how our family got here in the early 1900s and talk about what it was like growing up in Missoula in the 50s and 60s and coming back to the family business right after college and still being here 50 years later and what the community's meant to me. Touch a little bit on plants and growing things in Missoula, Montana, what it's like with our winters and what it's like with our soils and what the opportunities are.
Welcome to The Trail Less Traveled, an adventure radio series and podcast dedicated to collecting stories and sounds from around the world in order to take you back to mankind's earliest form of entertainment, storytelling. Missoula, Montana is a mecca for outdoor enthusiasts, and each week we will bring you tales of adventure from both near and far, as well as information and inspiration and a few tunes to set the mood. You can subscribe to the podcast and learn about our international outreach projects at traillesstraveled.net. And now, here's your host, international expedition guide, conservationist, and yogi, Mandela.
Today, The Trail Less Traveled is being recorded at Caras Nursery here in Missoula, Montana. And I'm sitting down with the owner of Caras Nursery, Bill Caras. Bill is a native Missoulian. His father was born here, and his grandfather immigrated from Greece around 1900. They all started Caras Nursery around 1910. We're going to get into the history of that soon, but I first want to start by saying thank you so much, Bill, for your time and energy joining me here today on The Trail Less Traveled.
Well, I couldn't be happier to be here because I've listened to your program for years and never dreamed I would be actually being interviewed by you. So I'm glad we got together, and I'm glad you thought of me, and I'm ready to go. I got all sorts of stuff I can share with you. Whether it's interesting or not, we'll have to wait and see.
Bill, you have a vast history here in the Valley in Missoula, and so I'd like to just talk to you about your early years. Where did you grow up, and how was adventure a part of your childhood?
Well, I grew up right here on 3rd Street in the house next door to the nursery. It was a little bit of a different neighborhood back then than it is now. That was end of 1953. I was born on December 30th. My mom would always brag that I was induced for a tax credit. And I'm thinking back to 1953 going, what did they use? And I've actually looked that up, believe it or not. But at any rate, so I grew up in the Orchard Homes on 3rd Street. My early years, the closest bridge over the Clark Fork was Orange Street. So we were really out in the country. Reserve Street ended at 3rd. Heading north, and then North Reserve was a mile away, and you had to go clear to Orange Street to even get over there. Mm-hmm. So it was a quiet neighborhood. Now it is pretty busy on 3rd Street. Quiet neighborhood, and it was very safe, and we had a lot of freedom. You know, I would show up at the school. We never had any coaches, and then 15 other kids would show up, and we'd do sports in the evenings, and then everybody would wander home about dark, which sometimes was 9 o'clock, and the parents just opened the door and said, come on in. It was very different than it is today, but it was a wonderful time in a lot of respects. My family, a lot of things were centered around work. My dad worked a lot growing up. You know, it wasn't like we were away a lot. Our family really, it's privileged, but we mostly went to Flathead Lake on weekends. Again, my grandfather started that in the 30s, and we still have the place today, and my grandchildren are enjoying it, so we're on our 5th or 6th generation. Anyway, my grandfather emigrated to the U.S. right after 1900 and went through Ellis Island, and I had nothing basically like so many immigrants, and wandered to Chicago, where he had a couple distant cousins that didn't treat him very well, and so it took a couple of years, but then he got on with the railroad, and at some point they sent him out to Missoula. He may have been coming out here building tracks, or maybe they just sent him here to work. I've never been sure about that, but a lot of Greeks and other immigrants did get here on the railroad, basically. He sent for his brother a couple of years later, and the next thing you know, they were entrepreneurs, and they wanted to find a business to go into. My grandfather, as a teenager, had kind of brokered some fruit in addition to shepherding goats in the Peloponnese of Greece. So he started selling fruit on the street for a season. And then they tried a couple other things. One of them didn't work, and then they went back into the fruit. And He eventually got a storefront, which was a narrow store with nearly vertical things holding all the fruits for people to choose from. And it was close to the corner of Higgins and Broadway, so right in the heart of Missoula. He was into it. He ended up succeeding with that. And then 10 years later, out here in the Orchard Homes, there was an existing nursery called Missoula Nursery that had been here since 1896. He found out they were going bankrupt. He had bought a few things from them to sell in his store. So he went to the bank and ended up buying it and taking it over and immediately expanding it. They were doing wholesale. They had greenhouses. They had all sorts of things. The fruit company was called Garden City Fruit Company because Missoula has long been the Garden City. And so it made a lot of sense. Then it became Garden City Floral when they transitioned from the fruit more into the flowers, and then Garden City Floral and Nursery when they got to the point where they had this nursery out here. It went along like that for a long time. As a child out here, it was a wonderful situation growing up, but there were things happening, kind of undercurrents that children don't notice. And at some point, everybody went different ways, even though I had a great uncle in the neighborhood and an uncle and an aunt and my grandparents and us. And all of a sudden, you fast forward 5 years or so, and everybody was kind of going their own way. The business held together after I was born for another 10 years, and then my uncle and dad had taken it over, and they split it in half. And my uncle took the Garden City Floral name, and my dad had to come up with a new name for the nursery. Someone said, you ought to call it Caras Nursery, which made a lot of sense because we were a pretty well-known family by then. And now, of course, I think we're probably a lot better known as Caras than as Garden City. Things just went along, and the businesses evolve, families change, and somehow or other I was just deeply affected by everything. And after I graduated from college in science and I was looking maybe at graduate school or something like that, I literally woke up one morning in Eugene, Oregon. It was maybe a month after my grandfather had died in 1976, and I just literally opened my eyes. I hadn't thought about it before because my mother really discouraged me from wanting to come back. I don't know why exactly. I think she had some bitterness maybe, but I just literally opened my eyes and went, I'm going back. I stayed in Eugene for a few more months, and then I came back and started out with both feet going first thing in the spring here. Spring's our season, and so I was very busy right from the get-go. I worked the first 90 days straight. I had some friends in town that found out I was here. They were not very happy with me that I hadn't contacted them, but I just was immediately passionate about it. There's something there, and I can't really explain it, but it's just some sort of almost like I wanted to validate that growing up feelings about the family and the business were real. All you have to do now is just fast forward 48 or 49 years, and I'm still here working at the nursery and enjoying it. It's had its stresses over the years. It's like any other business, but I don't know. I can't even explain it hardly, except for no regrets. The fact that I still enjoy it after that much time is a miracle, and it's also a blessing because so many people, are just can't wait to get out of their business or out of their job or whatever. So from that standpoint, I'm lucky. Some people might view it as a curse that I was immediately obligated once I came back. It wasn't like I was going to say to my dad, hey, it's been a couple of years, but now I think I want to go do something else. But it has afforded me a lot of learning. I'm a plant lover, first and foremost, and I learn something every day. Every day. I get asked a question just about every day that I don't know the answer to. It's a very broad subject. So from that standpoint, I'm a little nerdy. Examples, I'd be like, go home, instead of reading a book, I'll be reading a nursery catalog, or we're driving along the street in a city where we should go see something, and I see a garden center. I say, wait a second, let's pull over here. I just want to kind of check it out. And my kids roll their eyes. Of course, now they're quite a bit older, so they don't have to put up with that anymore. But that's kind of where I came from here in Missoula. It was a great situation. I love the fact that I got to know my grandparents so well, and my grandfather's story. I have, in the meantime, learned to speak Greek. I've looked up their relatives and been over there 8 times and spent a lot of time with them. And otherwise, they're second cousins. And so it's, first of all, remarkable that my grandfather left there 120 years ago. I still have second cousins there, but they're very excited every time I come over. And it's just been one of the things I've pursued that easily could have been let go. I'm the only one in the family that really has pursued it, the only one that's really learned the language, and I just love it.
That is the voice of Bill Caras. He's a plant lover, a native Missoulian, and the third generation owner of Caras Nursery
That's correct.
here in Missoula. Used to be called Missoula Nursery.
Back before my grandfather bought it, it was called Missoula Nursery, and they went bankrupt. But I have one of their catalogs. I've kind of pursued that as far as their history goes, and I have one of their catalogs, and they were very legitimate, but they must have just gotten in financial trouble. So they actually ended up moving to Butte and opening a nursery there and called it Missoula Nursery. So I have a postcard from 1906, and it's a picture of a store downtown, and it was written on there, Missoula Nursery downtown store. So, earlier I alluded to how far out of town this seemed to people at that time. Well, their solution was just to open a retail store downtown. Mm-hmm. So that's what they did. I did want to clarify, my grandfather came over from Greece, and his name was Katakitsos. Just a 3-syllable, pretty simple name. It sounds a little bit more exotic than that, but Katakitsos, he shortened it to Caras. And I wish I had been more curious when I was in my teenage years to ask him, because he passed away when I was about 23. But at that age, you're just not as curious. And he also, even from the get-go, signed Katakitsos with a C, and then Caras is with a C, but there's no C in the Greek alphabet. So again, I don't know quite why he chose all of those things, but it's just kind of a little interesting aside.
Wow. Bill, I'm wondering if you could talk about some of these black and white photographs that are framed sitting on the table in front of us. There's one that's an aerial view of Caras Nursery. There's another one of the downtown fruit stall. And then I think another one is of a greenhouse.
The first one is a downtown store where they had their fruit. You can see they have some outside in boxes and baskets, and then they have a wall of fruit inside. That's my grandfather in back and my great uncle in front. He was 2 years younger. My grandfather kind of set for him. His name was Sam Caras. Spiros is the Greek equivalent of Sam.
And this is on the corner of Higgins and Broadway.
Well, it's close there. It's about a half block away from Broadway. It's on Higgins. You can see they're very proud of it. There are a lot of old photos like this of stores. There must have been photographers that went around in those days and took photographs of stores. I've seen them for the Missoulian, a number of different things. It was their first storefront, and I'm sure that was very exciting for them. After they moved out to the nursery, my grandfather had some big plans, and so they moved into a house that was out here and started running it just as a spring business, and that's how it operated pretty much clear up until the 70s. It was just a spring business. There was a nice home that was about halfway back in this picture, and I have a photo of it that I just discovered. And it burned down after they were here about 6 years. My dad was about 6 years old, and they moved into a little shack in the back, which had been a kind of a mess hall. And that's where the 4 kids grew up with my grandparents, and I think my grandfather was a big saver. They hit the mid-30s, late 30s, when you'd think we were coming out of the Depression, and that's when he could afford to build this big brick house here. It's a 2-story brick house. It looks like it belongs in the university, and the family lore is that he told the architect Kirkamo that he wanted to have a university-style house. So that's the house I actually grew up in. It's my house. My brother and sister were there, of course, too. But my grandparents actually moved out a month before I was born so that my family could move me into that house because they needed more room at that point because of the third child, which was me. So I consider it my house, although I'm sure my sister and brother consider it their house.
So this is a photograph taken of Caras Nursery from above in an airplane. Who was flying this airplane?
Okay, so this is just a wonderful shot, and you can see how much he had grown the business by them. There are a number of greenhouses and a number of fields full of trees. This aerial photo was taken probably right after the war, so about 10 years after the house was built. And the pilot was my dad. He was a pilot in World War II. It was his true love was flying, not nursery. My true love, aside from my wife, would be the nursery, I guess. But he did a fine job running it, but he loved to fly. And then he had a photographer friend in town. They were very close, named Catlin. And Catlin took this photograph from the plane that my dad was flying.
I love it. Bill is a collector of maps, and right in front of me, I have a beautiful map. It shows Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming. Bill, can you tell us a little bit about this map that's in front of us and some of the history that you're aware of in terms of northwestern Montana?
My collection really goes from world maps to Western Hemisphere, then to North America, then to the United States, then to the western United States, and finally to Montana. I love the transition between 1861 and 1865. During the Civil War, they were able to take a lot of large territories and break them up a little bit, and that's when Montana was formed in 1864. The reason they couldn't do it before is they were trying to keep the legislature in Washington even between slave states and territories and free states and territories. And so there was a flurry of activity during the Civil War where they formed all of these different areas. And so it's been really fun for me learning a lot of that in that 4 or 5 year period, all these different configurations for Montana, what territory we're in, what territory eastern Montana was in versus western Montana. And finally, we take our own shape there about 1864. And this particular map is a derivative of 1864. Montana has about 8 counties or so, it looks like. Antique maps, I should say, really are the year they were printed. You couldn't really get the original plate very easily from these, so if they were printed in 1864, that's one thing, and then you have reproductions that are modern day reproductions of the printed maps. So this particular one is one that I've kind of specialized in because I think it's really fun, because Missoula runs all the way from clear down south of Dillon to all the way up to the Canadian border. So I find that interesting, and this particular one, I have a number of different iterations of it where Missoula is the entire county, but then down where Missoula, the city is, it says Higginson. And Higgins, of course, was one of our city founders along with Worden, and just think that's really funny. He tried to get it called Higginson, and it did show up on maps for several years there, but he did not succeed because everyone has forgotten that. But it's kind of fun to see maps that have it. The other thing that's kind of interesting about this map is our first territorial governor, I believe, was Edgerton, and he came out here. He was not well liked by the current residents of Montana. So they named a county Edgerton, and then as soon as he went back to Washington, D.C., they eliminated it. It no longer exists. And so those are a couple funny things I think about this particular map. Otherwise, it's amazing some of the things that had developed by then in terms of knowledge of the area.
And just looking at this map, Virginia City is major on the map, more so than Missoula's.
Absolutely. I mean, that was really our first territorial center, was Virginia City. So
Billings isn't even on here.
You're correct. That was a long time ago. And so the Bighorn County of eastern Montana is bigger than most states on this particular map, which is kind of funny too. There are some listings in terms of tribal designations and things like that. It's just a fun map to look at. It's fun to look at this particular series of maps from 1860 to 1865 and on to 1870. And then I have probably every other year after that, as Montana got more counties and more detail in terms of what was here, what was there. You can see Flathead Lake is kind of misshapen, and the later maps obviously got that corrected, and it shows some trails that were coming through and that kind of thing. Just makes them very interesting. Sometimes on the back of them, if they come out of an atlas, which is normally where they come from, there'll be either another map or a lot of statistics. But this particular one, it never gets old taking a look at it and kind of wandering through it.
That's a beautiful way of putting it. Taking a look at it and wandering through it. That's why I love maps so much. Bill, can we stand up? It's been a moment. We've been sitting, and we're going to just walk over here to your map drawer. And I'd love if you could pull open some of these drawers and just tell us a little bit more about these ancient maps.
Okay, well, I have a lot of maps. Here's one from the mid-1860s, mid-1850s. Of the entire United States. That one, of course, is French. États-Unis is how they pronounce France. But I have some that are much older, too. I love the really old ones that show the eastern U.S. developing, but the whole West Coast is undefined. Now, all these maps are really delicate in terms of how they would make the paper back then. They would take linen and grind it up and soak it and everything and set it on a screen and have it settle out, and that would form the paper. So even the paper making part of it. And then the engraving initially was done on wood, and they could make so many copies out of that. And then they started engraving on copper. The Italians started that. And a lot of the older maps from the 1700s were done on copper maps. And again, they would use them over and over, and eventually they'd kind of wear out. So sometimes you can get a map and you can pinpoint whether it was produced in 1678 or 1692, because they were identical, except for you can see wear and tear on the plate. Those are some kind of fun things to know about maps.
What year was this map printed?
That one was probably about 1830.
But you have one in your drawer that's from the 1600s, I
I
believe.
have several here. I just have to find them all. I have some from the 1500s that are of Western Hemisphere that are just totally fabulous.
Oh yeah, I seen this one.
Yeah, this is made in the early 1600s, and this was done by, I think, Mercator's son or grandson. You can see this one is not quite as clear as those other ones, and that's because it was a wood engraving. It's really fascinating to look at how they saw the world back then in terms of South America's totally misshapen, North America's totally misshapen, but you can recognize them. You also have a situation where the only place name in North America is Florida. They were just getting it settled enough and learning enough about it at that time to put these world maps together. They're really fabulous.
I mean, this is very interesting. This map, first of all, was printed the early 1600s before my ancestors even arrived in South Africa. And Antarctica is taking up a quarter of the entire globe. But Florida is actually printed on here.
It's a very old name. Again, on the printing part, this would have been a wood engraved, and then they applied the ink to it to draw the borders and the things, and then they hand colored it, every single map. And that was done clear up into the mid-1800s, maybe a little later than that, because they didn't have color printing. So a lot of these maps you see, someone, after they printed it and it dried out, then someone got assigned to hand color them. And you can see this has got kind of a filigree border on it. It's very pretty. And then the different continents are different colors. And the details, of course, leave a little to be desired, but that's what makes them so charming. The most famous map for map collectors, there was about 100-year mistake on maps where they had sailed up the Baja and they had never gotten to the end. And so they thought California was an island, and people really get a kick out of that. But it turned out they finally eventually were able to correct that on maps. You know, sometimes the information was a little shaky for these map makers, and then sometimes they kept it away from people because from an exploration standpoint, like you don't see many Spanish maps and Portuguese maps because they didn't want to share the information because they wanted to keep the information to themselves. In fact, they would put out misinformation. But in the 1600s and 1700s, there became a real market for maps. And there are a lot of famous map makers from those eras that did really elaborate borders on the cartouches along the edges of the maps of different scenes from that particular continent or country or area. So, you know, it was a real commercial thing at that point, and some of those maps are extremely valuable now. They're pretty rare and they're pretty extensively decorated. So it's one of those hobbies that just can get bigger and bigger and bigger depending on how much you want to get into it. Like I said, I've tried to find a way to focus my collection. I started with the world, I ended up with Montana.
I love it. Wow, we're here at Caras Nursery, speaking with Bill Caras, whose grandfather started Caras Nursery around 1910. And Bill has many passions. One is map collecting. I love maps, but I feel like I've just taken it a few steps up, knowing where you can get maps on the internet that come from the 15 and 1600s. I must take this opportunity to thank Bill, because he gave me the nicest gift I think anyone's ever given me. It's a map of Africa. Can you tell us about this one that we just unrolled?
Well, I believe this was a school map, and it was printed in 61. It's a fabulous wall map. It was probably used in a classroom, but it's huge. It's 6 by 7 feet, and it rolls up. It's got a major map of Africa, but then it has side maps, which are pretty good sized, and they kind of detail the colonization of Africa, which I find to be very interesting, but I imagine you find it to be 10 times more interesting because you know what a lot of that stuff means just looking at it. It's not just a fun map. It's a political map, and it has a lot of meaning because there was a lot of history, but I'm sure a lot of pain and a lot of arbitrary borders drawn and all these sorts of things. Different countries colonized there from Europe, and so you would be better to speak to that than I. But it has been really well taken care of. I was pleasantly surprised how bright the colors are and how it seems to be totally 100% together. It's very pretty when it's open, so hopefully you'll have it on your wall for a long time, and you'll learn something every day, just like I do about plants.
Pause and let the eyes wander. I love the fact that this map really highlights the rivers, which of course I'm passionate about, and many of those rivers in the continent of Africa I've guided on. So to have those take up so much of the bold, bright colors means a lot. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Bill teaches many classes for the community: perennials, native plants, bonsai, landscaping. Bill, can we just kind of start with some information that you think most of my listeners are from Missoula?
Okay.
So some information that you think Missoulians ought to know when it comes to plants and coexisting with said plants.
Well, coexisting is an interesting term. I love plants, and there are just a bazillion of them out there. From the time when I started with my dad, these selections were much smaller. We didn't have a broad range of plants available to us, and now that's really changed. And native plants, I know you wanted to touch on those. Most of those really weren't available either. I remember the first time I got asked for kinnikinick, I was like, why don't we have kinnikinick? And I went to great lengths after that to get kinnikinick. Now it's kind of generally available. I can get it pretty easily, but that's a native plant that I'm very partial to. That's just a little story. The problem today is we have this broad palette of plants that we can grow here. Some of them are better than others. Some of them are just more fun, and you might lose them some winter. But the problem we have now, of course, is deer. We didn't have deer when I started here. And so we went from having a small selection, and then I built up to a huge selection over the years, mainly out of interest and experimentation. And now I have to ask people every time I'm helping them, how big a problem are deer? And if it's a big problem, they either have to go back to the narrow palette of plants, or we need to talk about how they can kind of protect them until they get established. My feeling is we need to coexist with nature and encourage nature, but as far as deer go, they don't want to really talk about it. But otherwise, I think it's extremely important as a way to bring nature into your home and around your home, and there are a number of benefits above and beyond just the obvious ones as far as ornamentation or that sort of thing. There's shade, you can create areas, there's color, there's fruit, there's all sorts of different categories of plants we sell. I think the main thing I would communicate is a lot of people are curious about, do I have to have so much lawn? And lawn is standard American fare, and it is one of the easiest things to maintain, though, because we stay on top of it, just like vacuuming. And when people do more beds with plantings in them, they tend to not pay attention because there isn't the urgency. And then they turn around 6 months later and it's full of weeds, and they go, where did they come from? Mm-hmm. They actually started out very small. So part of it's just being in touch with what's happening in your yard. Mm-hmm. And then, the sky's the limit. There are all sorts of interesting areas, whether it's flowering shrubs or perennials, shade or sun. There are all sorts of plant characteristics, flowers, fruit, bark, shape, fall color, all of these things. There's just a world of it out there. Beyond that, I would say putting it all together is a really fun thing. I've done a lot of landscape design over the years and had a really good working relationship with my clients. I have a lot of fun with them. Hopefully we make some ideas come true for them. A lot of times it's more of a communication on top of throwing some knowledge in there, and then what happens on site. Very often when I'm doing a landscape installation, I'm there a lot, setting things out, making decisions, and then I see other opportunities as opposed to, say, having a drawing that takes away that flexibility. So all of those things are a lot of fun. As far as the classes go, I think there is a lot of interest there. And my main thing, I guess, is as far as coexisting with plants, is I just want people to succeed with them. And we have a pretty dry climate here, and we have some soil challenges, especially with pH here. And so I hate for people to fail and then be discouraged. We have weeds, but they have weeds everywhere. You just have to learn how to stay on top of them. You don't have to spend any more time than you do mowing the lawn, but you have to spend the same amount probably. So the idea that you would have a maintenance-free landscape is just not true. It's outside, things are growing, seeds are blowing in, all those sorts of things. So for people to succeed, I think 90% of the battle is when they do plantings, to baby them a lot. Outdoor plants for here are very wimpy at first. They can't go without water. And so you can't just water them once or twice. You have to water them consistently until their roots get out into the soil and they're picking up moisture from different sources. And when that happens, they're incredibly resilient. A lot of problems we have are when people initially plant, they think they can water it once or twice and that's going to be adequate, and it's not. Beyond that, their fertilizer regimens are not anything that's a big concern. So again, it's pretty easy for people to succeed, particularly if they're willing to kind of pay attention to their plants. They'll see when they're wilting. They'll see if they've got a bug, because again, bugs are like weeds. You get one bug and that's it, and then you don't notice it, and then 4 months later your tree's covered with it, and you're like, how did this happen? They must have just all flown in at once. But that's not how it works. So plants have so many benefits for us, beauty-wise, but also psychologically, and all of these things. The shade they provide, the color they provide, obviously the fruit they provide. And so I just want people to succeed with it. That's a big part of it. You have noticed a couple things that are different from when I started here. One is a lot more trees get killed by line trimmers, which are better known as weed whackers. Mm-hmm. People knock the bark off the tree in a concentric ring around the trunk, and that kills the tree, because the only living part of a tree is right under the bark. Mm-hmm. Or obviously the buds and the leaves, but under the bark against the trunk is where all the cambium is. And everything inside of that used to be alive, but it's turned into structural wood to boost the tree up. But all the living part is right under the bark. So it's very important you protect that, because once you break it, it doesn't really heal like we heal. And if you go all the way around, the tree is going to die. But even if you go halfway, it's going to never be the same, and it's going to be structurally not as good. So people can kill with kindness. If they have poor drainage, they can overwater, because the roots really need air in the soil, and too much water they just can't handle. If they have good drainage, they can hardly overwater, though, especially in our climate here. So it's not too critical in a lot of situations. Finally, I guess a couple of things I've seen the last decade or so in Missoula. Nobody used salt before for ice, and I'm seeing people just lather it on these days all over the place. You know, if it washes off the sidewalk and gets concentrated in the soil close to a plant, even in the lawn, I've seen it kill lawn in the last decade too. So again, it's kind of a common sense thing. It only can do so much as far as the ice goes and everything like that. And then if they sweep it up when they're done, then they won't track it all over, for one, but also it won't eventually run into the soils where it can cause some trouble. So all of these things really are built around my love for plants in combination with I want to see people succeed. Obviously, if they succeed, then they're going to continue gardening and they're going to continue to be a customer. So it isn't totally altruistic, but there's nothing better than when I run into somebody that's planted something that's a tomato plant that produced hundreds, thousands of tomatoes for them, or a tree that's grown a bunch and is suddenly, shading their home and providing interest and joy for them that way, or color, all of these things. I love it when people succeed with those things and they get to enjoy them and they get to see the fruits of their labor. And part of it is avoiding unintentionally hurting a plant. As far as native plants go, in the industry, I would say it's been about 40 years. There's been a lot of interest, but really only the last decade or so there's really been the demand. The industry for me has always preceded the demand. When I first heard about ornamental grass, for instance, bunch grass in landscaping situations, I thought it was just great, and I grew a whole bunch and nobody bought them. Now we can't hardly keep them in stock. We sell thousands of them a year. As far as the native plants go, it's a matter of understanding how plants grow and how they work. A lot of native plants, get in a situation where they're all of a sudden getting a lot of water and getting treated really well. They grow too much, they get leggy, and they're not that pretty anymore. So, part of it's finding the right location. Some native plants in particular, but even some non-natives, Once they're in the ground for a while, they really need almost no supplemental water. So they can save you a lot of moisture. Almost all evergreens are that way. Just very little supplemental water. Once they're established, until they get established, it's a problem, but beyond that. But now we have good demand for native plants, and we're learning more and more about them and how they're going to work in a landscaping situation. I love learning about them, and the ornamental plant industry is so far ahead in terms of developing dwarf varieties of ornamental plants and this sort of thing. Disease resistance, all these things they select, and then they propagate them asexually, which means they either root the cuttings or they graft them so that every tree or every bush, whatever kind it is, they're all identical. They're all clones of each other, more or less. And, the native plant part of it, it just isn't there yet. And also, like I said, some of them don't behave themselves that well in terms of how big they get and how they take over. And again, it's finding the right situation for native plants, but otherwise we have a lot less problems with them in general than we do with some of the other things that we plant a lot of.
I'm sitting here with Bill Caras. His grandfather started Caras Nursery back around 1910. Bill, one thing that I think people ought to consider doing on their birthday is planting a tree. So if whoever's listening out there decided, yeah, that's a good idea, I think on my birthday I want to plant a tree for the next 3 years. What 3 trees come to mind that you think would fare well in a Missoula yard?
That's a pretty loaded question for me because I love trees, and I love a lot of different aspects of them. One of my favorite evergreen trees is an upright native called subalpine fir. We have a little trouble with those here, but generally they're pretty well adapted. They don't take up nearly as much space, say, as a Colorado spruce. So that's definitely one of my favorites. I will say that there are cultivars, we call them, of blue spruce now that stay narrow like that are going to be probably more deer resistant and a little more resilient, but subalpine fir is definitely one of my favorites. Missoula is kind of a maple town, so there are a lot of new maples that weren't available before. Some of them are hybrids that are 2 different types of maples that were crossed together. So there I would say one of the Japanese Korean maple crosses. That's going to be an exotic compared to a native plant, but it's a really nice Japanese looking maple, which we have trouble with here. Stays smaller, great fall color, beautiful foliage all through the season. So that would probably be my second choice for something a little more unusual to be planting. Beyond that, we are a maple town, so there are tons of maples, but there are also now some really nice oaks that do well here. And so if they wanted something that grew narrow and vertical, there are a bunch of oaks have been sort of selected that way. There's one called Kindred Spirit, and there's one called Crimson Spire. And so if somebody needed something that didn't get too broad, having an oak as an alternative to a maple might not be too bad either. Beyond that, there's hundreds of choices, and it's fun to learn about all of them. I wish I could plant them all.
Well, I hope if you're listening, you come on down to Caras Nursery on your birthday and you talk to Bill about what tree you ought to plant in your yard. I'm sure that he can make a good recommendation based on where you live. Bill, you were born here, your father was born here, your grandfather came here in 1900. When I say here, I mean Missoula. I feel living in Missoula is a privilege, and with privilege comes responsibility. So as more and more people move to Missoula, what do you think we can do collectively to keep this such a beautiful place?
Well, I didn't expect that question. So, I just think if we can be kinder as the traffic grows and honor the environment. So it goes way beyond your individual yard. We are surrounded by all of these wonderful areas that are close by. To me, it's really quite a privilege. I walk my dog every day and I don't have to start my car. That is a deal. And I take her up the mountain. And so I think just honoring what we have and not taking it for granted and not being arrogant about the land and to be positive. I think all of those things are important, and maybe they'll wear off on people that move here that aren't, but there are plenty of people that are here that aren't positive necessarily either. So I'm a big proponent of optimism and being positive and those sorts of things, and I have absolutely no problem with people moving here. I just want to be surrounded by nice people, and I think that's our community. And if you're a native but you're arrogant about it, that doesn't impress me at all. Mm-hmm. So I think it has to do with the people. We've had lots of turnover here in Missoula over and over and over. It's that kind of town, and we've still kept a real spirit here. I won't name any other towns, but the only thing I will say beyond that is I really haven't lived too much of anywhere else except during college. So maybe my pride in Missoula and my love for Missoula is because I don't know any better. But my grandfather found a pretty good place in 1905 or so, and we're all still here. So it must be a good place, huh?
That's the voice of Bill Caras. He's the owner of Caras Nursery, which his grandfather started. Bill, let's end your show with 3 bits of advice on life that you can share with whoever's listening out there.
Well, again, I have to go back to the positive part and the kindness part. They sound kind of trite these days, but I always feel like I've had to develop this over time. There was a time in my career, for instance, where I was really stressed out with the business, and I had to just sort of forge through it. But now I'm positive most every day. It's been some work, and I don't let the big things get in my way nearly as much, and I appreciate family, and I appreciate the things that I have. I've had a good gig, and not everybody has, but I think no matter what your gig is, there's good stuff out there happening. You have to hang on to that and not fall down into that negative area, that kicking the tires type of thing. Far be it for me to tell people how to live, but appreciating the people around you, being kind to people around you, being good to people you're close to, I think those are all really important. And then I can also circle around to our environment as well. We've got a heck of a deal here, but we're all part of the same atmosphere. And again, we were given this gift of life here on earth, and we just can't afford to be arrogant about what it is because we're just a small bit part of it.
Bill, thank you so much for your time and energy joining me here today on The Trail Less Traveled.
It was my pleasure, believe me. It was my pleasure.
My name is Garrett Titus, and I'm the Conservation Policy Specialist for the Montana Wildlife Federation. The Montana Wildlife Federation is the oldest conservation organization in the state, dating back to 1936 when conservationists joined landowners to address the loss of Montana's natural resources. MWF continues to advocate today to protect and enhance wildlife habitat and outdoor access. My conservation tip of the week would be to leave things nicer than we find them. If everyone on Earth picked up 1 piece of litter per day, no matter how small, that would result in 8 billion pieces of litter properly disposed of daily. This effort would no doubt make for healthier water, land, and air, which, according to the Montana Constitution, we all have a right to a clean and healthful environment. So please, go out and make sure you pick up your piece of litter, and be sure to join the Montana Wildlife Federation's membership at montanawildlife.org. Once again, that's montanawildlife.org to get involved today.
That's it for this week's adventure, my friends in Missoula and around the world. But until next week, please remember, conservation is not a spectator sport. Living in Missoula is a privilege. With privilege comes responsibility. Please get educated and engaged. Speak up on behalf of wildlife and wild places. And if you think you're too small to make a difference, well, then you've never spent the night with a mosquito.